This presentation is about understanding the T in the acronym LGBTI, or understanding what it means to be a transgendered individual. This is part of staff training at Summit Preparatory School. Many people don't really understand what it means to be transgender. They assume it's the same as being gay or lesbian. So it can be helpful to understand all of these categories that make up LGBTI. This includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. And sometimes you'll see included as part of this acronym the letter Q. Q stands for questioning or queer. Now the term queer used to always be thought of in negative terms, but it's now been adopted by some as a positive term to refer to anyone whose gender identity and expression is outside societal norms. In defining LGBTI, it helps to explore categories related to gender. These categories include biological sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, and gender identity. Let's begin by looking at biological sex. Biological sex does not determine gender identity. And while most people think that all children are born as either biologically male or female, this is not the case. In fact, in about 1 in 1,500 to 1 in 2,000 births, the child is born with ambiguous sexual anatomy. And many more are born with subtler forms of sexual anatomy with variations that don't really show up until later in life. So using the genderbread person, which I borrowed from the website, it's pronounced metrosexual.com, we can see that biological sex is just one part of gender. A person can be born with female anatomy, male anatomy, or what's called intersex. This is the I in LGBTI. Intersex refers to individuals who are born with external anatomy or chromosomes or internal reproductive systems that are not really traditionally associated with the standard male or female. And it's important to point out that being a transgender person is not the same as being an intersex person, although one can be both. These terms are not mutually exclusive. The next category we want to explore is orientation, which really has to do with the heart, or who one is romantically and sexually attracted to related to gender. And referring again to the genderbread person, sexual orientation refers to who you are physically, spiritually, and emotionally attracted to based upon their sex and gender in relation to your own. Sexual orientation is a continuum where one can be heterosexual, bisexual, or homosexual. And the terms most commonly associated with orientation include the term straight, which means you're romantically and sexually attracted to the opposite sex, lesbian, which is the L in LGBTI, which means you're romantically and sexually attracted to the same sex, in this case female, gay, which is the G in LGBTI, which means you're romantically and sexually attracted to the same sex, in this case male, although sometimes the term gay is used to refer to homosexuality in general, and bisexual, which is the B in LGBTI. This means you're romantically and sexually attracted to both sexes. And it's important to know that transgender has to do with gender expression and gender identity, and it's not the same as being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. One can be homosexual and transgender, bisexual and transgender, or straight and transgender. The next category we want to explore is gender expression, and this involves the traits associated with being either masculine or feminine. Referring again to our genderbread person, this means one can display feminine traits, androgynous traits, or masculine traits. This means that one's expression of gender can either be masculine, feminine, or gender variant, and this includes things like behavior, the clothing we wear, our haircut or hairstyle, our voice, and our body characteristics. The T in LGBTI or transgender includes people whose gender expression is different from those typically associated with their assigned sex at birth. To understand, it's helpful to look at several examples. One example is people who like to wear the clothes of the opposite sex, or to cross-dress. And it's important to point out that this does not necessarily mean that they're gay, as against, gender expression is different than orientation. There are many straight individuals who cross-dress. It also does not necessarily mean they want to be the person of the opposite sex, because again, gender expression is different than gender identity. People who cross-dress typically do it for their own personal reasons, but there are also drag queens and drag kings. These are individuals who wear the clothes of the opposite sex primarily for entertainment or theatrical purposes. Another example of being transgender related to gender expression, although in this case many times also related to identity, are those who are gender nonconforming. These are individuals who choose to live outside traditionally defined binary gender roles, and so do not identify as either male or female in the traditional sense. They sometimes refer to themselves as being a third gender or gender queer. In this case, again, using the word queer in a positive, self-affirming manner. The final category related to gender is gender identity. Do people think of themselves as either a boy or a girl? And this also falls on a continuum in regards to gender identity. One can feel like a girl or a woman, one can feel bigender, and one can feel like a boy or a man. It's important to remember that gender identity is different from biological sex, in that gender identity is really in the brain. One can be anatomically male and identify as a man, or one can be anatomically male and identify as a woman. One can be anatomically female and identify as a woman, or one can be anatomically female and identify as a man, or regardless of the anatomy, one can identify with aspects of both genders. The term transgender includes people whose gender identity is different from their biological sex assigned at birth. And I'm using the phrase assigned at birth in recognition of the fact that some individuals are born with ambiguous sexual anatomy. Related to gender identity, typically most, but not all, transgender people seek to make their gender expression match their gender identity rather than their biological or birth-assigned sex. One example of a transgender individual is someone who's bigendered. This is someone whose gender identity encompasses both male and female components. In other words, they identify both male and female sides to their identity. Another example of someone who's transgender is someone who's transsexual. This is a person who feels a very strong disconnect between their assigned biological birth sex and their gender identity. Because this disconnect is so strong, often these individuals require some degree of anatomical modification to bring their bodies into congruence more with their gender identity. This is accomplished through taking hormones or through surgery, which is either called sex reassignment or gender reassignment surgery. There are other terms that it can be helpful to be aware of. One is transition, and this refers to the global process of medically, legally, and socially changing from one gender to another. This transition is typically either male to female, where a person who's assigned male at birth now lives, presents, and/or is transitioning to female, or female to male, where a person assigned female at birth now lives, presents, and/or is transitioning to male. In regards to hormone therapy, there's two types. One is called hormone replacement therapy. This is where a person receives the hormones associated with the gender that the person identifies with and is transitioning to. This typically involves either taking testosterone or some form of estrogen. There is also puberty-blocking hormone treatment, which really suppresses the inevitable primary physical changes that puberty causes, such as facial hair or the development of breasts. So transgender is an umbrella term used for people whose gender expression and/or gender identity is different from those typically associated with their assigned biological sex at birth. In this way, transgender really refers to all gender variant or gender non-conforming people. And some of the students we serve at Summit Preparatory School are transgendered, so there are several important do's and don'ts. First, don't make assumptions about a transgender student's biological status. Again, remember that gender identity is different than biological sex. Transgender is not caused by some form of ambiguous anatomy. Next, don't make assumptions about a transgender student's sexual orientation. Again, remember, gender identity is different than sexual orientation. This means a transgendered person can be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or straight. Next, don't assume transgender is a choice. Although anyone can choose what they want to wear or how they want to appear, gender identity is not a choice. Here are just a few facts that underscore that. 80% of transgender adults knew they were different before leaving elementary school. Less than 4% of transgender people realized they were transgendered after 18. So this is not something that an adolescent or young adult at some point in life just chooses. In fact, the average age of transgender self-realization is 7.9 years. Why it may seem like an adolescent is choosing to become transgender, however, is because learning the words to communicate these feelings and being able to share these feelings with others typically does not occur until about the age of 15.5 years. Although with the increased knowledge about transgender, this age is becoming less and less. Next, don't assume that being transgendered is a psychiatric disorder. It is not. Unfortunately, however, similar to homosexuality, it's taken way too long for the medical and the psychiatric community to recognize this. Until 1973, homosexuality was considered a psychiatric disorder in the DSM. Similarly, until the DSM-5 was released in 2013, being a transgendered individual, you were also assumed to have a disorder, a gender identity disorder. Now, insurance companies require you to have a disorder in order to receive treatment. So from a positive standpoint, this did help ensure that transgendered people had access to care, such as hormone therapy and sex reassignment surgery. But the negative is that it reinforced being transgendered as a pathological condition, where you're delusional or have a cognitive distortion or exhibit deviant behavior. The DSM-5 replaced the category of gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria. This reinforces that being transgender is not a disorder, but it can lead to intense distress or dysphoria when one's body is not consistent with one's gender identity. This can be intensified if one receives negative reactions by others because one is transgendered. This can result in intense anxiety and depression. In fact, a recent study pointed out that a transgendered individual is 9 times more likely to commit suicide than the national average. Next, don't make a transgendered student feel fake by saying things like, "You look like a real girl or boy." Perhaps you mean well, but this just undermines their sense of identity. Don't use offensive slang like tranny, she-male, he-she, or transvestite. Don't assume that a transgendered student is somehow different sexually or that they're hypersexual. Being transgender tells you nothing about a student's sexual behavior. Next, don't behave in a judgmental manner to a transgendered student based upon your own personal beliefs. You need to learn to behave in a professional manner, including following the do's and don'ts in this presentation. But if you're struggling with how to respond to a transgendered student, be honest about this. This is what helps make all of us better professionals. And take this issue to your supervisor or go to one of our directors to talk through this. Next, respect a student's gender identity. If the student is presenting as a girl, then address them as a girl. If presenting as a boy, then address them as a boy. Next, call a transgendered student by their chosen name and preferred pronoun, typically he or she. This is important as for some transgendered people, using the wrong pronoun or being associated with their birth name is a source of tremendous anxiety. So you want to respect the name and pronouns that the transgender person is currently using. In general, transgender should be used as an adjective and not a noun, because it only describes one part of a person's life. For example, you would not say that Chris is a transgender, but instead that Chris is a transgender person. Next, familiarize yourself with the terminology. This makes connecting with a transgender student a bit easier and also shows that you care. Next, respect a transgender student's confidentiality. Beyond the treatment team and our residential, clinical, and academic staff, not everyone who the student has contact with while they're at Summit Preparatory School will necessarily know that they're transgender, so don't out them. It's really that student's choice as to whether or not they want to share that aspect of their life. Work to help keep our transgender students safe from bullying, ridicule, or abuse. And as a general rule, treat transgender persons the same as everyone else of that gender. If you have any doubt how to act, just use some common sense and act as if they'd been born and raised in the gender they are presenting. And finally, remember that these are just teenagers. They're not something foreign to us. So treat transgendered students unconditionally as you would treat any other student. This includes not over-focusing on gender if that is not the issue. For a lot of our students, their primary issue is not that they're transgender, but it's something else going on in their life. I hope this was helpful, and thank you.